Okay, this is the third time we're meeting, and what I want to do today is I'm going to go into why this concept of deep time, that is the old Earth, the concept of deep time, a little bit more of why it was invented and how we deal with that as creationists and believers in a young Earth. We went into this slide last time. Basically, in a nutshell, what's happening here is this vertical line in the historical period, anything to the right of that timeline is unobserved. Either it's because it's in the future or because it is in the past without any direct observations. And so therefore, it necessarily follows that in order to recreate this unobserved, unmeasured past, we have to resort to conjecture. And there are two terms that we want to clarify. One of those is uniformity, and the other word is uniformitarianism. And they're often confused, but one, the uniformity is the basis for natural law, the idea that natural law, within the known process of natural law, are the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. That axiom is necessary for all inductive reasoning. So uniformity of natural law underlies real science. Uniformitarianism, however, was something that was invented around 1800. And what the story back then was that we want to remember in 1800, you've already had the Enlightenment for at least 2 centuries. So by 1800, it was obvious that speculation apart from the Bible was yielding all kinds of ideological results. And one of the problems was that the resistance to the Enlightenment kept coming from the Christian community. And the resistance kept coming from the Christian community because of the Bible. So many of the thinkers in the Enlightenment, they'd already tried historical criticism. And we get that, you know, when you go to seminary and you have a course in Old Testament introduction. The Enlightenment had already begun to undermine the text of the scriptures. But one of the truths of the Bible that just acted as a resistance point was the age of the earth. So people at the beginning around 1800 decided if we can undermine the young earth, which by the way, interpreters for the 18th centuries had always thought of the Bible as teaching a young earth. So there were debates about particular passages, but generally Christian thinkers believed in a young earth for 18 centuries. So what these guys tried to do was to figure out a way they could use the noun science with all of its credibility that was developing by 1800. If we can use that term because of its high credibility to undercut this vital point of biblical history, because if we can undercut the whole idea of the young earth, we render the whole historic testimony of the Bible as suspect. So the deal was that we would take the word uniformity, which everybody accepted. The new science was developing in chemistry and physics and optics and so on. Everybody intuitively understood what uniformity meant. But what they did is they took uniformity and turned it into a new word, uniformitarianism. Now, the reason they did this is because going back to that diagram, you remember, you have to go into the unmeasured, unobserved ancient history. So to do that with science, you've got a problem because you don't have any measurements. So how do you get back into the unobserved history, this unobserved, unmeasured, but somehow convey credibility? So that's what this doctrine, uniformitarianism, is a philosophical invention that underlies historical geology. It's the belief that only natural processes observed today can be used to account for the observed geological, chemical, and atomic structures, I should say, of the past. So we're going to project natural processes that we know and we observe. We're going to extrapolate them backwards into this unknown area. Well, the second part of uniformitarianism that led to the old age idea was that the rate of such natural processes observed today has always remained about the same. So rates of erosion, rates of deposition, that sort of stuff, we observe those today. So what we're going to do is we're going to assume that it was always the same. Well, you marry point 1 and point 2 together and you've got the old Earth, because obviously to account for mountains and so forth, for river valleys, and we'll talk about those specifically in a little bit, to account for those processes, to be the causes of what we geophysically observe, and we know they're slow today because our environment is relatively tranquil compared to the past, then we've got to have long ages. So it's under this idea, which was an invention, that's what we have, and what we now call deep time. It's a philosophical invention to get back into the past that has been unobserved and unmeasured. Now, that's just not me saying that. Here's Ernest Mayer, who was an outstanding evolutionary biologist. Notice what he says. He comes out of the field of biology, which means he's into evolution, which means he's into deep time, on the trying to understand how these complex biological structures got established with known processes that don't seem to show much evolution today. So here's what he says. Evolutionary biology, in contrast with physics and chemistry, is a historical science. So at least Dr. Mayer makes the distinguishment between normal, straightforward laboratory science and technology and trying to move science backwards as a historical tool. So he contrasts evolutionary biology with physics and chemistry. That's good. But notice what else he has, because he's aware of the implications. Laws and experiments are inappropriate. See, he's right. They are inappropriate because you can't measure, you can't do experiments like this. So instead, now notice this one. Instead, one constructs a historical narrative consisting of a tentative reconstruction of the particular scenario that led to the events one is trying to explain. So now what we're doing, and Mayer's right, there's nothing wrong with this statement. What he's saying is that when you try to study unobserved history, unmeasured history, you can't do it in the normal scientific method. So you have to resort to a different methodology. And that's the key, a different methodology. And so that's why he says laws and experiments are inappropriate. Instead, you construct a historical narrative. That's why on that limitations chart, I put the word conjectures. That's what you're doing. You're conjecturing a historical narrative. You're using your imagination, and that imagination's fine to think about, but you're using it to construct a narrative. So let's be straightforward here. Historical science is not the same as everyday science that's produced the advances we see technologically in our society. Now, the problem is that we have neo-evangelicals that agree that this has to be the method and then forsake the evidence of the Bible. Because if you think about it, special revelation, and this is how I started this series back on the first day, we always have to remember you've got to use special revelation, God's word, to interpret the environment around us, which is general revelation. Special revelation has to be used to interpret properly and correctly general revelation. A good example of that would be Adam and Eve in the garden. If God had not spoken verbally and given them information about one particular tree, how would Adam and Eve known what tree they should eat and what trees they should not eat? The general revelation just presented trees, period. So how do you distinguish one tree from another tree? Well, God allowed Adam to name the different trees probably, but the point is that there was one particular tree that they should not eat of. And the only way they could know what tree it was they should not eat of was for God to tell them, which means you have to rely on verbal special revelation. But here's the problem. Here's Paul Tillich, one of the outstanding theologians of the 20th century. Look what he's saying. And he represents a consensus of theological reasoning outside of our conservative circles. And it's this kind of reasoning that's leaking into some areas of evangelicalism. There are no revealed doctrines, but there are revelatory events and situations which can be described in doctrinal terms. The Word of God contains neither revealed commandments nor revealed doctrines. So ultimately what Tillich is reflecting is modern theology's idea that we have encounters of some sort that we interpret in our subjective minds without any special revelation. We just interpret these, we intuit them as somehow we're experiencing God. So this cuts off all special revelation as historical information. So now the problem is, why is it that we evangelicals are such opposed to this sort of thing, an old earth thing? It's because it's a fight over the domain of special revelation. Does it exist or doesn't it exist? And if it does exist, over what areas? Because one of the themes in the new evangelical thinking, it's not really new, it's been around for a long time. The old earth idea is that parts of special revelation, parts of the Bible are good for faith and practice. But other parts like history, we can relax. We don't have to hold to the fact that they really are literally special revelation. They're sort of the cultural accoutrements of the authors of different parts of the Bible. But that runs into a problem. The problem is that when God speaks to the nation, when he spoke to Noah, he left a contractual agreement between the human race and the geophysical universe. And he specified by special revelation certain things about geophysical stability. That was a contractual arrangement. Now, the problem is in the Bible, these contracts, whether they're the Noahic covenant or contract, or the Abrahamic covenant or contract, or the Mosaic covenant or contract, the Davidic covenant or contract, why do we have God establishing these contractual documents, as it were? One reason is to allow us to measure his faithfulness. So that's why when you get a loan from the bank, the reason they make an agreement, credit agreement, loan agreement, is because the bank wants its money back. And they're going to measure our response by our deposits and so on. Are we paying off as we promised in the contract? Well, it's no different here. God establishes a contract and he says, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, and so forth. And the rest of the Bible is a historical confirmation of God's faithfulness. So the problem you have once you start limiting the domain of special revelation, you are also limiting the domain by which you can measure God's faithfulness. Is he a faithful God that we can trust? And then Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 introduces another thing. And that is when he says, look, if Jesus Christ did not rise from the dead, a physical, observable event, if that historic event did not take place, and we're saying it did take place, that makes us people who are committing perjury by the 9th commandment. So here you have the 10 commandments ethically are violated if you have people in the Bible testifying to something that never happened. So to me, there are these special things about special revelation that are built into the Word of God to protect the Word of God and to alert us when people start messing with the historical validity of the Bible. So the point is, going back, thinking back that chart again of limitations, the point is to get over into the unknown areas, unknown as far as any scientific measurements are concerned. You have to resort to the Bible, because after all, there really are observations all the way back to creation that are recorded in special revelation. So when you try to reconstruct ancient history, if you omit special revelation, then you can be an old earther. But if you're going to admit special revelation, you can't say it's unobserved history. It is observed history. God gives us a verbal report with information in it. So that's why creationists are saying, okay, we're going to accept the biblical narrative. The biblical narrative has lots of things in it spiritually, but it also reports certain key events. So if we're going to take special revelation prima facie, then we're going to have to accept the fact that we do have measurements. In fact, we can start building a reconstruction of the past. Okay. Now what I want to do now is I want to show you how this, go back to this deep time situation.
Charlie?
Yeah.
Just a comment on Paul Tillich. That John Hanna used to say that when Paul Tillich died, he had one of the largest collections, private collections of pornography in the country.
Wow. Didn't know that.
Yeah,
I used to, when I was at MIT, some of us used to go up to Harvard to listen to Paul Tillich just so we could understand a little bit more of where he was coming from. He was impressive, as far as his intellect, but obviously he had a few other problems besides.
I think there's sometimes these connections that are going on in the background. That's what I think we see in the LGBTQ movement, and one of the reasons it's gotten so powerful is that there are a lot of sympathizers, if not practitioners, out there in the business entertainment world that are in the closet, and they are providing cover and support and financing for these movements. And
yeah,
you see this same kind of perversion going on in the background with people, like Paul Tillich, liberal theologian, and it influences, changes, and degrades Christianity.
Yeah, yeah.
Anyway.
I think there was a book written by an English guy, I forgot his name, called The Intellectuals, in which he goes into the ethical lives of these people. I remember reading some reports of Darwin. When Darwin was writing Origin of Species, he was sick all the time. In fact, he had a basin right next to his desk so he could throw up. It's kind of interesting to know what's going on with these guys like that. Okay, here are, the question obviously is, in 1800, when you had geologists, Terry Mortenson's book from AIG is important. That's is a popular version of his PhD dissertation, where he went to England for a year or two and went through all the libraries. He talked to descendants of the early flood geologists that were living in the early 1800s. They were all amateurs. There were no professional geologists back then. All geologists were amateurs, and there were flood geologists then. And they were, it was kind of like I told you about manufactured consensus. What happened was Lyell, who was a lawyer, not a geologist, had financial backers. And he decided that they were going to deal with this whole issue of the Bible and get rid of it. And in fact, I think I have a quote. Let me see if I have one here. Yeah, here's the quote. And this gives you a flavor. If you look at this quote, you can get a flavor for the animosity that these people had toward the Bible and its claim of a young earth. The physical part of geological inquiry ought to be conducted as if the scriptures were not in existence. This was written to a fellow Uniformitarian geologist. Lyell wrote he wanted to free science of the geology from Moses. So this is the same spirit you encounter in Old Testament introduction with the higher critics. But here it's expressed in a gross, clear way. Notice the physical part of geological inquiry ought not, see, ethical judgment, ought not to be conducted as if the scriptures ought to be conducted as if the scriptures were not in existence. In other words, get rid of special revelation. Any report inside special revelation must be eliminated so we can get on with historical geology. We have to free science of the geology from Moses. So I show you this quote because people kind of read about history and, oh, these were the scientists. They were innocent men. They were just simply looking for truth. Well, not really. There was a motivation behind them, just as Robbie pointed out about Tillich. Darwin, remember, Darwin comes 30 years after Lyell. People think everything started with Darwin. It didn't. That was Terry Mortenson's PhD dissertation. He points out the thing started with Lyell, not with Darwin. It was Lyell that established the old Earth, which then allowed Darwin to argue for slow evolutionary changes. Darwin could never have argued that if he hadn't first started with his feet in deep time. Darwin wrote, he who can read Sir Charles Lyell's great work on, let me push this thing off my screen here a little bit. Let's see, can't get rid of it. He who can read Charles Lyell's grand work on the principles of geology, which the future historian, notice here, Darwin speaking, will recognize as having produced a revolution in natural science, yet does not admit how incomprehensibly vast have been the past periods of time, may at once, I guess, read this volume. And that's Terry Mortenson's work, where he collected these quotes. Here's what happened. Darwin went on the HMS Beagle, and he had this, that was where he went to the Galapagos Islands, and he looked at the beaks of various birds. But his primary thing on the Beagle was going into South America and noticing river valleys. And he was so taken over by Lyell's explanation that these vast changes in terrain, the highlands, the hills, the valleys, they could not have been created quickly. Those valleys and hills came about by long, slow changes. So Darwin recognized that, and he seized upon deep time for the underlying foundation of evolution. So that's why I'm trying to show you these ideas are all interlocked. Okay, now I'm going to go into 3 evidences that Lyell and the Uniformitarian guys used back in the early 1800s. I'm going to talk about 3 of them, and I'm going to then go into some of the details of their problems with them. There were 3 things they pointed to. One of them was volcanic deposits. They operated in Europe, and in Europe, of course, they saw Mount Etna, Mount Vesuvius. And Mount Etna and Vesuvius had these eruptions and were historically observed. And so what Lyell and others did, they said, well, look, these giant areas of deposition around Vesuvius and Etna, we know from our observations that these eruptions occur, from time to time, but it must have taken many eruptions over a long time to explain the terrain around them. So that sounded very logical. After all, these men are using observations, but they were conjecturing about uniformitarianism, meaning, what about this rate of processes? Are Mount Vesuvius and Mount Etna representative of all historic time? And of course, they had never observed back in the previous century the massive eruption of Mount Krakatoa. When Krakatoa exploded, it affected the climate on the Earth for 2 years because of the debris that was thrown up into the higher atmosphere and stratosphere. It just stayed up there and acted as a filter on solar energy. So that was a massive explosion, a volcano that exploded with far higher power than anything these early geologists had ever seen before. So that's the idea of a new observation beyond their base. And of course, again, you remember back when Robbie had Steve Austin showing us Mount St. Helens. Well, Mount St. Helens blew off. Again, it affected the climate in the United States because these eruptions are so powerful. They blow fine ash so far up into the air. It's not just in the atmosphere, but up into the stratosphere above the atmosphere. Airplane travel. After Mount St. Helens, the air traffic control had to divert aircraft because the jet engines were ingesting all this ash. So again, what do we learn from this? The idea in 1800s, 1810, 1820, in that period, they were relying upon local observations of the recent past and trying to extrapolate those into long time intervals. So again, modern observations show that their base was wrong. They just had a finite data set, and we've added to that data set now with these large explosions. So what about our explanation then? What do we do in the young Earth? Well, during the flood, to have a global flood, there must have been hundreds of volcanoes, some above water level for a while, but most were underwater. And the reason volcanic activity must have been massive during the flood is the fact that you have the separation of the continents, and you have tectonic plates that are moving around. I mean, again, South America gets ripped off from Africa. So you've got that wide expanse of the South Pacific where the plates underlying South America and underlying Africa had to separate. And all of that kind of separation would cause all kinds of release of magma and so forth. So it's very plausible on a creationist flood geological basis, the fact that there had to have been a lot of volcanic ash. In fact, thinking about that, you can say, look at the wisdom of God in having Noah build a boat and having the earth covered with water. The earth being covered with water would have shielded Noah from certain destruction from all of the geologic activity. The water acted sort of as a suppressing blanket on a lot of the activity, and the ark could just float. Didn't have to go anywhere. It was a barge that just had to float. So we are not impressed with the evidence of volcanic deposits around Mount Etna and Vesuvius as the all-time normal model of how volcanoes work. The flood would have totally violated that model with high energy, rapid changes. Okay, volcanic deposits, that's one line of evidence that early geologists used. The second one, and I'm going to show some diagrams here. The second one is river valleys. The question is, how do we account for river valleys? Do rivers take millions of years to cut down through rock layers? So the point that the early geologists were making, they saw erosion. After all, they had the Rhine River in Europe. They had the rivers in the UK, in Spain. So the point was they had data, but they had it as only the placid, slow erosion that was observed in their day. And they extrapolated that by the doctrine of uniformitarianism backwards. Now, I'm going to show you something that's interesting. This is a recent study that was done by one of the creationist geologists about water gaps. Now, what are water gaps? Well, let's look. A water gap, if you look on the right side here would be the present situation where you have a river cutting through a mountain chain, or if not a mountain chain, at least high hills. Now that presents a dilemma. How did the river keep cutting through the mountain? Wouldn't gravity tell you that the river should go around the mountain, not cutting through the mountain? So the models that the geologists have come up with, and again, this is conjecture, and the deep time explanation tries to explain why the river appeared to have cut through an elevated ridgeline by staying unchanged while the surrounding land somehow slowly eroded. So to go over to the left side, this is the conjectured model of how it started. You have these layers of the earth, you have this placid stream or this river on the top, and the earth layers happen to have a hard area. So the light gray here would be softer soil. The dark would be harder, like rocks. And so the stream would be doing its thing, but what would be happening simultaneous with this river valley, this small little river going on, is all of this gray layer would be eroding. And this is what's the incredible part of this idea, that somehow it all eroded. So you get the second picture in the middle. See how the thickness of that gray layer has gone down, and it's now exposing this hard area. And so you have this hard area appearing to be above the river when before it was below the river, and it just happened to have a break in it. So the river didn't mind, didn't go around it, and just kept going through it as this gray layer eroded down. And then finally it erodes to almost nothing. And so we come along and we observe this stream going through. Well, the idea is that why did the stream stay in this position? And how did this whole land surface erode in such a limited way, smooth way? If this, while this erosion was occurring in this gray layer, if it was not level, perfectly level, the river would have changed its course. But the river did not change its course. And so the only explanation is this had to have been eroded somehow. All this debris had to be evacuated out of this area evenly so that the river was never disturbed. So this is the model of a water gap. And these occur all over the place. This happens to be from western Montana. Okay, let me show you the flood model. In the flood model, how do we explain these river cuts? Well, the first is A, B, C, and D. There's 4 stages here. The first stage is the flood. So you have the water all the way up to the top of this rectangular solid diagram. So there's the flood water. And the water flows perpendicular to a hard ridge. Again, this is varying hardness in soil, various resistance to the water. So at first, you have the water translating across this ridge line in the flood. Okay, go to B. In B, you have during the flood, the softer areas would be worn down as the flood continues to wash over that ridge. Then the flood recedes in picture C. There the waters are down, so no, there can't be any erosion anymore at the higher levels. The erosion has to only be in this area of weak soil. And then finally, the flood goes away, and you just have this lowest gap in the river. So the water gaps are explained in flood geology by phenomena that were generated during the flood. And there are various arguments for why that's so. Okay, that's the second line. We've gone from volcanic deposits to river valleys. The third, they weren't talking about radioactive dating or anything then, because didn't have it. So the early guys in the 1800s had volcanic activity, they had river valleys, and the third thing, they were impressed with sedimentary rock layers. And that is, they observed it. They observed the Alps had sedimentary, very thick sedimentary strata. And they said, look, those layers must have taken a long time to form. And erosion would have been slow. In fact, it's amusing if you go drive on some of the interstates where they've made cuts through ridge lines, and you can see the strata there. And sometimes it's interesting, you see the strata that it goes up and down. In other words, it's warped. And you sit there and you look at maybe 100, 200 foot high cut, and the strata you can see visually in the rock layers. It's like a wavy line. Well, you know that it couldn't have been hard, and then the compression forces caused it to crumble in a undulating pattern. The rock would have had to have been soft to show that undulation. So when you look at a cut like that and you see the layers slowly going up and going down, gradually going up and gradually coming down, you know that it all had to be moist and flexible, because if it were hard, it would have fractured. It wouldn't have been smooth layers. So we have then the issue of how do you account for sedimentary strata that is so deep and thick? And how do you account for the fact that you have a flood with chaotic flows somehow creating these beautiful, carefully striated thin layers? Well, the answer was again found at Mount St. Helens. In that eruption in 1980, and there was a glacial flood in 1999 in Iceland. In both of these cases, the results were that strata was laid down in fine, ordinary, orderly layers. Now, how chaotic high energy flows cause the result to be these fine layers, we don't fully understand yet. But the point is, it happened. We have visual evidence of it laying down. In Iceland, 200 layers were laid down in 17 hours. 200 layers. How could chaotic glacial water with all kinds of eddies in it and everything else somehow deposit these beautifully structured, gentle layers? Same thing happened at Mount St. Helens. So the question then is the speed of deposition. Well, now here's a picture. And this is not just one picture. This is from Europe, but we have them in the United States. How do we explain polystrata fossils of trees? Now, if it's true that it takes millions of years to deposit strata, how is it that this tree somehow stayed there for millions of years while the rock slowly built up around it? Well, obviously it didn't. The polystrata fossil shows you that those layers were developed obviously quick enough so that the tree didn't rot in the process. So there's visual evidence of the fact that the slow idea of uniformitarianism doesn't fit the data. Okay, Let me go on and talk a little bit now about deep time and some of the research that's been done on radioactive stuff. And I refer you, if you want details about this, I can refer you to Project RATE, R-A-T-E, by ICR. It was the first $1 million apologetics project in the history of the Christian church. And it took a group of scientists that wanted to relook at how we date. I'm not going to go into all the details. They did find that there's discordances. When you date a rock layer by different methods, you get different dates. So there's something, it's called discordance of radioactive dating. Why do we have different clocks giving radically different ages for the same object? Something's not right here. But I want to just concentrate on one easy to see process. Radiocarbon.
Charlie,
carbon. Yeah.
before you get started on this, I'm going to try to put a link in. I'm looking for it now. But in that first conference we did around on evolution creation around 2007 or 8, where John Whitcomb spoke and Steve Austin spoke, one or two of his presentations dealt with a lot of the findings from the RATE project as well. So that's a good video to go back and to watch, and that's up on the DBM website.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ravi. But in a nutshell, here's the deal. Radiocarbon is carbon that has extra weight here. Carbon is atomic weight 12, and radiocarbon is 14. So it's unstable and it breaks down. But here's the clinker. The half-life of radiocarbon is 5,700 years. So let's think about that. If you have radiocarbon, and let's say it was generated in the atmosphere about 1 million years ago, every 5,700 years, its presence goes down by 50%. So obviously, if the Earth is very, very old, in the areas that are very, very old, you shouldn't see any radiocarbon. Because if you use the math, it turns out every 5,700 years, it goes down by a half. By 100,000 years, there shouldn't be any. Here's the clinker. There's no place on Earth where you can't find radiocarbon. So now what does that do? Well, obviously you've got a problem. So the other side, the old Earth explanation is, well, rainwater leached radiocarbon down into these deeper layers that are older. So that's why the radiocarbon is in them. Well, the counter to that is radiocarbon is found inside diamonds. So no matter how much rainwater you have, you're not going to push a C14 atom into diamonds. So that's one of the findings of Project RATE, and they have a whole bunch of other findings, but that just shows you creationists haven't been absent in dealing with these scientific problems of dating methods. And then, of course, you have the other situations involving the different argon, potassium argon, and so on. That's all explained in Project RATE. And if you go on the ICR, I think they have some, or no, it's AIG, I think it has a layman's thing. It says, I think thousands, not billions, is a sort of layman's summary of all that research. Okay, I want to conclude with a simple demonstration that you can do in your church to people. All you need is a candle. And I did this with my granddaughter. She had just taken algebra course and she learned about first degree equations. So I said to her, I said, Aura, you know what a first degree equation is. Y equals AX plus B. Now I want to show you how you can use algebra and understand this old Earth, young Earth argument. So I took a candle. I did this also in Beth Haven Church as a demonstration. And I have the candle lit, but I don't tell you when I lit the candle. So let's pretend you're in this another room. in church, I did it behind the pulpit. So I have a candle burning. Now then I take the candle out so everybody now can see it. Now here's the question. How long has the candle been burning? To answer that question, what do you need to know? It's a process. And okay, you see the process is observed today, uniformity process. But now how can you tell when I show you the candle that's been hidden from your vision and I bring it out in front of you and you see it burning and I challenge you to tell me how long has that candle been burning? Well, first of all, you've got to know the starting length of the candle. See, there's the equation, starting length of the candle. And you also have to know the burn rate and the burn times time. And then you know how much the measurement is today. So L0 is the original length. Lm is the length you observe. You want to solve the equation for T. How long has it been burning? But to solve the equation, you've got two unknowns. See, this is the first degree equation. Y equals AX plus B. Here's the B, the original condition, and here's the A on the variable. So you have to know all of those two terms. Now you can solve for the burn. So you solve for T because we want to know how long has the candle been burning. So you solve the equation. You can take the original length minus the present length divided by the rate of burn. But then when you start saying, well, I didn't observe the initial condition precisely. So if you don't know the initial condition and you're talking about a process, you can't date it. And here's the second problem. You can't correct for the rate. So one of the things I challenged my granddaughter was, I said, how do you know before you came into the living room and saw this candle burning, Aurora, you know, and I showed her a fan. And I said, you suppose I turned the fan on that would have made the candle burn faster? And then I turned the fan off when you came in, so you think the candle's rate of burn is slow. So she understood, and she was kind of satisfied that all the work she'd done in algebra she could use. So here's a case, a simple demonstration. You can do it in your church. You can do it to your young people's group, and just make them think about how do you date a process when you don't know the initial condition and you don't know the rate of burn. Okay, it's toward the end. Any Q&A?
You know, Charlie, I still have that candle in my office.
You do?
Yeah. And well, Jeff and Megan Christian say hi, by the way.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's a simple thing. And I forgot to mention something else that's been exciting, recent research. A lady evolutionist scientist was examining a dinosaur bone from, I think, Montana fossil graveyard. And she discovered under microscope there was organic molecules on the surface of this dinosaur bone. And the Creation Research Society has raised money. Again, you see, science takes money to do a whole project on why is it that dinosaurs that supposedly lived for hundreds of millions of years, they're in fossil graveyards. The bones are fossilized, but why is there a blood protein still left intact on the bones? Well, I had a PhD guy in my church for a year or so, and I told him, I said, Jeff, I said, why don't you go look at the literature and find out how they can explain the survival of delicate protein molecules on a bone that's fossilized for 200-300 million years. And so he did his research, came back to me later, and he said, Charles, you see, you know what they're saying? Just shows you how long blood protein can last.
Yeah, that reminds me of an illustration Ed Bloom used to use in talking about presuppositions, that a guy became convinced that he was dead. And so he was recommended to go to a psychologist. And so he goes to the psychologist, and the psychologist recognizes that he's got to be able to help this guy understand that he's not dead. So for months, he is talking to him about the characteristics of a human dead body, and primarily that a dead body doesn't bleed. And so he talks about it. They go through, they see video. He takes him through various experiments with different lab animals and everything, that when a creature is alive, it bleeds. When it's dead, it does not bleed. And then after going through all of this, where the man is just completely convinced that dead things don't bleed, then suddenly and secretly the psychologist whips out a needle and pricks the guy's finger, and the guy bleeds. And the guy looks at his hand and he goes, "How about that? Dead men bleed after all."
Yeah, yeah, that's a great illustration of presuppositions. Okay, well, I wanted to make some conclusions here. When I started this back 3 weeks ago, I made the point that in the 19th century, in those early 1800s, we in the conservative Bible community were very slow in responding to the deliberate attacks on the Bible. And because these critics recognize the age of the Bible is one of the impediments to the whole Enlightenment movement. And we were slow at that. And you think 1830 to 1960 is 130 years it took the Bible believing community to come up with a good start on scientific research on the matter. And that was Whitcomb and Morris publishing The Genesis Flood in 1960. But the question you have to ask is, why were we so passive in not accepting the authority of general revelation? We tried hermeneutic gymnastics to try to get days to move into ages. We tried all kinds of problems. We were making the compromises, not the other side. And Whitcomb and Morris in 1960 decided enough is enough. We're going to force the other side. We're going to put general revelation underneath the authority of special revelation. And that there was all kinds of explosive interactions with Whitcomb and Morris, believe me, when that happened. But here's my concern, guys. Let's not be passive and slow at dealing with the present day attacks on all the divine institutions. Human responsibility, choice is under attack. Marriage and binary sexual gender is under attack. The state is attacking the idea that parents have the final authority in the education of their children. We have the fourth divine institution, the civil power that God has ordained to restrain evil, turned into an agent of redemption, as though we're trying to rebuild the Tower of Babel. These are assaults coming upon these institutions. And it behooves us to join with some of the other people. Some of the guys are conservative Roman Catholics like Brian Anderson, and done good research. But we have got to teach our people the strong necessity of God's created structures that are not going away. And when you violate these created structures, you are going to pay a severe price. And we need the facts out there. We need to challenge these people back to the presuppositional level. And so that's my concern. And quickly summarizing this idea about science, to respect real science versus the fake science of historical geology. We need Bible. Remember the quote I had that science can exist only on a certain soil. Science is not automatically part of every culture. It was part of Western culture. Western culture, not because of Western white old men, but because the Bible had influenced Western culture. Bible made Western culture what it is, superior culture, economically, politically, and so forth. And science arose in the West because science needs the natural environment to be subject to rational understanding. That came about from the Jews. That came about from Hebrew chokmah, Hebrew wisdom, as Albright pointed out. The Greeks didn't suddenly come up like you're taught in philosophy classes. Oh, the idea that the universe is rational. They borrowed the idea, it was circulating around outside of Israel. And Albright in the Yahweh and the Gods of Canaan makes that point. Second, science needs support to reason deductively. It needs universal, immaterial, unvarying laws of logic. We have a creator, we are made in his image, he is omniscient, and he is the support for our deductive reasoning. Without deductive reasoning, you cannot build a theory. Science needs support for inductive reason. If we didn't have that, we'd have to repeat experiments every day to make sure things hadn't changed. The belief in the uniformity of natural laws is part of the stability that special revelation tells us God built into the creation. And finally, the fourth thing, science needs ethical standards for honest reporting of research and the use of funds. Both of those are problems right now in the university campuses, filled as it is with neo-pagans. Fake research that grabs headlines, funds that are misused for different things, funds that are used to create artificial consensus by excluding from publication people who differ at certain levels. And finally, I really leave with you Proverbs 25:1 or Proverbs 25:2. I've always thought of this verse. It is the glory of God to conceal a thing, but the honor of kings to search out a matter. Science, in this sense, is a wonderful, exhilarating of seek and find, of hide the thimble kind of thing. God has hidden his glory in his handiwork, and it's up to us to uncover it and discover the neat things that he has built. I'm done, Robbie.
All right, great. I've got one question for you, Charlie.
Yeah.
We've got in this group of men here, we've got an array of experience and study. We've got people who are been around like you and John Page and myself who've been reading and studying on this issue since since the 60s. And then we have others who are relatively new to this whole topic. Now, Ray gave us a great bibliography that's pretty extensive. So I'm going to ask you, what if you were going to recommend a starting point, maybe 4 or 5 foundational books that you think every pastor ought to read, every person ought to read and think through in terms of all these issues related to creation, evolution? What would you boil it down to? What would you think would be the best starting places for this?
They're generating these kind of summaries pretty rapidly. I don't keep up with all of them, but if you go to Answers in Genesis, AIG, they have some just general books. They even have, you can start with some of the stuff they've done is great for middle school and high school, just because those kids have questions now, and they're getting very skilled in giving illustrations of it. There's videos that are available. I would also recommend that you get, if you can, get hold of the original book that caused creationism to arise in the 20th century, which is Whitcomb and Morris's The Genesis Flood. It's available on the Creation Research Society website, and I think ICR still has it. But that was the book that started it all. And the reason why I think that book is so fundamental is because it was written by a theologian and a scientist. They dealt with the exegesis problems of the Old Testament, and that was Whitcomb. He taught Old Testament at Grace Seminary. And then Henry Morris was a civil engineer specializing in hydraulic flows. So you have that combination. So I would recommend that as a good starter, because it will illuminate you on how this whole thing blew up in 1960. and started this creation thing, and they restored the authority of special revelation. So I'd say that's one of the key books, and I think the list that um, Ray gave us is a lot of good stuff in it.
Yeah, right, right. I was just thinking about, like that's what I was thinking is Genesis flood's important because, that's the foundation of really the whole creationist movement, and it's a great starting point. John Page put up here John Morris's The Global Flood, which is he says is easy, simple. Those are good things. Of course, we've got to break things down into I think some different areas: biology, geology, um, things of that nature. The feasibility of the ark. I think one of the books that really I thought was impressive as a follow-up to Whitcomb and Morris is John Woodmarappy's book on the Ark of Feasibility Study, and he did a great job there. But there's a lot of them, and Jason Lyle with Answers in Genesis, I think has done some good work. He has several good works. I've skimmed a couple of them. I haven't read them. John Williams.
Jason Lyle has written a great book called The Infallible Proofs of Creation, something like that.
Right.
And the reason that one is so powerful is twofold. One is he very clearly goes through the reasoning, the logical reasoning, and what are logical fallacies in reasoning. So that's number one. Number two, the appendices of that book is worth the price of the book, because in the appendices you see him responding to critics of the Creation Museum, laughing at it, attacking it, and he answers all of it. But what's so good about that particular book is he first teaches you what the reasoning issues are, and then in the appendices you see him applying those reasonings to critics of every stripe.
Now, which book was that?
That was the Infallible Proofs of Creation. I got to run over to the shelf and I'll get it in just a minute.
Was that the ultimate proof of creation?
Yes, Robbie, that was it.
Okay, because I've got that right here, and I'll put a link up here for people on the in the chat window.
Okay.
Yeah, I've got that. That's good. He's got another book on logic that's good too. So he's a sharp guy to be aware of. And also, it's a good thing as the Answers in Genesis website has so many good things for kids, things for Vacation Bible School. We've used their Vacation Bible School curriculum at West Houston Bible Church. Andy's used some of it. We've David Dunn at Grace Bible Church. We've tried to where one of our churches buys a material, then we share between us, and so that's been good. And then they also have good material for Sunday school for kids, and we've tried to do some different things like that. We have a good collection of these videos in our church library where people can get them and check them out and watch them, and that's a good thing to constantly bring to mind for us. I forget about these. I get so many things going on that I'm studying, and so it's good to remind people kinds of things. So it's a great tool.
Well, two quickies here, Robbie. One is that the videos, and these are videos any guy could show in his church. The one on In His Image, Made in His Image, or whatever it is that ICR did, it's that 4-video set that goes into the engineering in the human body, including how a baby is born, coming from an all-water environment to an all-air environment within minutes. And he shows you all the systems that have to change. And the other one he's done is the making of a baby. And it's the whole issue of how fertilization occurs. Amazing. It takes 4 million sperm to create a child. And he goes into all the details. And when you see the intricacy of God's handiwork, it causes in your heart a wonderment. And the second quote is, if anybody wants anything on the climate change debate, I didn't get into it, but I have a publication that I have published with Cornwall Alliance, and I can get that. I can send it to you, Robbie, and we want to put it on the site.
Right. Also, with the some of the PowerPoints you've used, if you can share those, and we can put that up and send the link out from the Box account, and guys can download that as well.
Okay, I'll send the whole slide set to you.
Okay, great, super. All right, guys. Anybody else have any questions, comments?
I have a question, Robbie.
Okay.
How do we know that all these changes that happened during the flood didn't happen when, in Genesis 1:9, the Lord separated the waters from the earth and he made the earth rise up? How do we know that these things happened at the Noahic flood and not at the flood in 1:9?
Because if you move the geological processes back into Genesis 1, you have to revert to a local flood.
Why?
Because you've accounted for the geological strata already in Genesis 1, so you have nothing left to validate Genesis 6 and 7. It's all in the Genesis.
The other question I have is, if the fossil remains were created during the Noahic flood, why aren't there any sheep and goats and horses and cows and bulls in the fossil record? All there are dinosaurs and aquatic fossils.
Because the domesticated animals were all probably you can see that this is discussed. True, it's not exactly true that there are nothing except dinosaurs. There's a wide range of fossil evidence, and
Right.
we just hear about the dinosaurs because they're kind of weird, kind of unusual. But dinosaurs were observed as late as 1500 in Europe, so it's not true that they all are just aquatic. They were destroyed in the flood. They survived.
Well, I asked Steve Austin this question when I was with him, and he just left the question off and said that some of the mammals were real small and therefore they were insignificant. But the quantity of dinosaur fossils, if God created the domestic animals like sheep and goats and cows and bulls, let's say for even sacrifice purposes, there would be a lot of them on the earth. Yet in the fossil record, if you look for a mammal, mammals are very small and they don't comprise hardly any of the fossil record. If they were destroyed in the flood in Genesis 1:2, they would be there and there would be no mammals. All there would be dinosaurs.
Well, we don't know that dinosaurs were existing then. The problem is that
is true.
You've got the problem goes back to what Whitcomb and Morris made the point in 1960. You either have to go with a massive change and explain the earth in terms of Genesis 1, or you've got to deal with Genesis 6 and 7. The trade-off is that every time people moved into Genesis 1, you have to diminish Genesis 6 and 7. And so the point is that you've got a wide variety of fossils, and I'm not sure you don't see mammals in the fossil record, primarily because, remember, the studies recently in creation science have pointed out there's a reason why you have an overabundance of aquatic fossils, and you have diminishing amounts as you come up the chain into mammals and so on. These people, why don't you have a good explanation? Forget the sheep and think about human beings. You don't find any human fossils, very rare in the flood. It's probably because all of those bodies rotted. They're floated. They're floating bodies. Happens from floods today. So you have to have an unusual situation to create a fossil. And this new reconstructions on the North American continent show that if you look at all the dinosaurs, they are fleeing. The tracks are not the kind of dinosaur track where they're just wandering around. Those animals are fleeing, and they're fleeing into the western part of the United States, which was believed to be a higher level, higher elevation as the floodwaters went up. Remember, the flood took time to build. So you have the more locomotive animals able to flee. They fled, and they were the last to be drowned in the situation. So you would also have a lot of their bodies just simply rotting in the water.
Can I make a comment on his question on Genesis 1:9?
Yeah.
If we believe in a literal 24-hour day, 6 days, there were no animals yet in Genesis 1:9. There were no animals to day 6. So how could it be fossils of animals in Genesis 1:9?
Yeah.
Good point, Ralph. Good point. Another book that I ran across while I was doing some searching on these other books that we've mentioned is a book there's several books by a guy named Bodie Hodge. Bodie, B-O-D-I-E, Bodie Hodge. And Bodie is, he's a researcher with Answers in Genesis. And he's got a book that looks like it's designed for kids called Dragons, Legends, and the Lore of dinosaurs. And that looks pretty interesting. And I would also recommend an older book that ICR had out called, I think it was Before the Deluge or something. I'm not exactly sure right now, but it also deals with a lot of the historical legends of dinosaurs and compares those to dragons and dinosaurs.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating to see the fact that there is up to the late Middle Ages. There's if you believe that dragons and dinosaurs are related, then you have the existence in some parts of the world of dinosaur type creatures that we think of is still in existence.
And the other thing, Robbie, is that reptiles keep on growing as they age, and if the dinosaurs and the other animals lived as long relative to their present time span as human beings did, remember, human beings lived 9 centuries, and if you have reptiles living that long, they're going to be big. And after the flood, these dragon stories, while they are big, they're not all consuming big like the ones in the fossil record. And recently, Acts and Facts just has a report where they took these carpet off of the middle of a church in England where a guy in 15 or 1600 had been buried, and they saw on the top of the casket engraving scenes from his life, and one of them had a dinosaur in it. And we're talking now, this is 1600.
Wow, that's tremendous. By the way, look at the chat window now, because when we close out, it's gone. But we've got a couple of things there. Michael in England has put a link there on the paleontology collections and fossil mammal collections that there's at the museum, that there's hundreds of thousands of mammal fossils that are out there. And Will Buttermore also commented on that. And Mikhail said the museum's fossil mammal collection contains an estimated 250,000 specimens from around the world and is rich in type and figured material. So there's an example there to go to find information. I think it's a misunderstanding. I think I've heard different explanations. We don't know. What we can count on is the word, and the word would indicate that they were there. Human beings were there. Massive number of human beings. If we take the Genesis account, at face value, there were generations. We may have had as many as 20, 30, 40 generations living at the same time. World population estimated by Whitcomb and Morris was between 2.5 to maybe as much as 4 or 5 billion people conservatively. And the fact that we don't find but very few human remains, but we do find them, indicates that there were other dynamics in effect at the time. They were running to high ground. They weren't trapped in the soil, in the mud, as smaller creatures would have been trapped, all of which would have been necessary to form a fossil. So those are.
And also, Robbie, years ago, when I was with Henry Morris, we were driving along Interstate 81, and I asked Henry about, hasn't there been any findings of human implements and paraphernalia in the coal mines? And he said, yeah. He said there are several. He showed me some of them, but he said that the problem is that the miners that he's talked with to check on this all report the fact that the stuff was taken to the Smithsonian Institute and never heard from again. So Lord knows where it is.
Yeah, I have some slides that John Morris gave me that I've used, where you have one of them that was is a brass bell with a figure on top of the bell that looks like a Baal figure, and beneath it is a brass bell, and this was found in deep inside of a coal vein, coal. And so where did that come from? I mean, it's a well-tooled, beautifully crafted bell. It shows some religious, idolatrous influence. Where did this come from? It couldn't have just couldn't have happened in there over hundreds of years, and shows that there was an advanced civilization that made this prior to whatever catastrophe would have brought about the formation of coal.
Yeah. Yeah.
So good stuff.
Robbie, haven't you ever read Exodus? Remember, Moses came down, they had a golden calf. How did he get there? Aaron said they just melted some gold and out it came. That's how that thing got in the coal mine.
All right. Let me close in prayer. We got to run, but I'll have this up probably. I hope to have it up on the website by on a box account by tomorrow or Monday at the latest. So let me close in prayer and we'll wrap it up. Father, thanks for this time. Thanks for Charlie's tremendous input. So much to think about and so much to explore. And as pastors, we have just such limited time. Father, we pray we can be efficient in the way we study and learn, and never grow weary of learning and studying and pursuing the truth of your word. Father, we pray that you would give each of us the time, the focus to prepare for our messages on Sunday, our Bible studies, our Bible classes, expand our spiritual and mental horizons, that we may continue to lead and shepherd our people and teach them so that they can continue to pursue spiritual maturity. We pray for our nation, that our freedoms be maintained and not destroyed by those enemies on the left that constantly seek to destroy the truth. And Father, we pray these things in Christ's name. Amen.